What happens when a flight attendant becomes the biggest threat to a corporate giant? Renee Caldwell thought she was just doing her job until she found herself caught in a power struggle that could bring down an empire. A whispered warning, a dangerous proposition, and a game where losing means losing everything. How do you fight a battle when the enemy controls the entire system? Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The air inside John F. Kennedy International Airport was thick with the hum of early morning activity. The smell of freshly brewed coffee from the terminal cafes mingled with the crisp scent of polished floors and airline disinfectants. The PA system chimed, announcing another departing flight, its automated voice lost in the symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and muted conversations. In the employee lounge of Nova Skyways, Renee Caldwell adjusted the neatly pressed collar of her uniform in the small mirror by the lockers. The soft navy fabric sat perfectly on her shoulders, the golden winged emblem on her chest a subtle reminder of the years she had spent in this industry. She ran a careful hand over her slick-back bun, ensuring every strand was in place before exhaling softly. Another day in the sky. The lounge wasn't empty. A few other flight attendants sat at the tables, sipping coffee, scrolling through their phones, or going over their itineraries. Some were young, fresh out of training, their enthusiasm still unshaken by the realities of long-haul flights and entitled passengers. Others, like Linda, a woman in her late 40s with decades of experience, had settled into the routine with a quiet resilience. "Another long one today?" Linda asked, taking a sip of her coffee, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had been through it all. "New York to San Francisco," Renee answered, checking her schedule one last time. "Straight shot, but we've got some high-profile passengers on board." Linda smirked knowingly. "Let me guess, VIPs who think the entire cabin belongs to them?" Renee chuckled. "Is there any other kind?" It was part of the job, dealing with demanding passengers who saw first-class service as a right rather than a privilege. But over the years, she had learned to handle them with a kind of detached professionalism. It wasn't personal. At least that's what she told herself. Just as she was about to grab her tote bag, a voice called out from the hallway. "Caldwell, office, now!" The sharp tone belonged to Henry Bolton, the head of customer service operations. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his neatly tailored suit. His expression was unreadable, but Renee knew from experience that whatever he had to say wouldn't be pleasant. The chatter in the lounge quieted slightly. Linda shot Renee a glance, but Renee just gave a small nod before following Henry down the hall. His office was cold, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The walls were bare, save for a single-frame photo of a Nova Skyways jet soaring against a golden sunset. A large desk sat in the middle of the room, pristine and uncluttered. It was a stark contrast to the bustling warmth of the employee lounge. Henry closed the door behind them and sat down, motioning for Renee to do the same. "I'll get straight to it," he said, folding his hands together. "I heard about your request for a management position." Renee straightened slightly in her chair. She had put in for a promotion months ago, hoping to transition into a leadership role within the airline service division. She had the experience, the track record, and the glowing reviews from passengers. If anything, she had more qualifications than some of the people who had already been promoted. "I reviewed your file," Henry continued, his tone neutral. "You're a good flight attendant. Efficient, polite, no major complaints." Renee kept her expression steady. She knew where this was going. But Henry leaned back in his chair, sighing dramatically. "This position requires someone with a certain presence, a way of commanding authority among the staff and passengers alike." Renee's stomach tightened. She had heard variations of this speech before. "I believe I have that presence," she said carefully. Henry smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile people gave when they were about to say something they thought was a compliment, but really wasn't. "You're great at what you do, Renee," he said. "But let's be honest here. Passengers expect a certain image from management." There it was, the unspoken truth, her skin, her voice, the way she carried herself. She wasn't what he pictured when he thought of leadership. Renee's fingers curled slightly against the armrest of the chair, but she kept her face unreadable. I appreciate your feedback, she said evenly, though her pulse was hammering against her ribs. Henry nodded as if the matter was settled. Good. Now you've got a flight to catch. Let's not keep our VIPs waiting. Renee stood up, her movements controlled. She had spent years perfecting this, hiding her frustration behind professionalism, swallowing her disappointment without letting it show. She gave Henry a polite nod before stepping out of his office, letting the door close softly behind her. Outside, the hallway stretched long and empty. The hum of airport life continued just beyond the walls, but for a moment, Renee just stood there, taking a slow breath. It wasn't the first time she had been dismissed like that, and she knew deep down it wouldn't be the last. But something inside her felt different this time. As she walked back toward the lounge, the weight of Henry's words lingered, but so did something else, a quiet, simmering resolve. She had a flight to catch. And on that flight, there would be passengers who thought they owned the world, men like Henry who believed they decided who belonged where. Renee wasn't going to let them define her, not anymore. The first-class cabin of Flight NX-217 from New York to San Francisco was a picture of effortless luxury. Soft golden lighting bathed the space in a warm glow, reflecting off the polished wood paneling and plush leather seats. A faint scent of citrus and fresh linen hung in the air, Nova Skyway's signature fragrance, meant to evoke a sense of exclusivity. Renee Caldwell moved through the aisle with practiced ease, adjusting pillows, ensuring glasses were spotless, and mentally preparing for the flight ahead. The passenger manifest had already informed her that today's flight carried one of the most high-profile figures in the aviation industry. Byron Lancaster, CEO of Aerolux Holdings. She had heard the name countless times. Aerolux was Nova Skyway's biggest competitor, a powerhouse in the luxury air travel market. Unlike Nova Skyways, which prided itself on inclusivity, Aerolux catered almost exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, often reinforcing the idea that the skies belonged to a select few. And Byron, he was the kind of man who thrived in that world. The cabin crew finished their pre-flight checks as the first-class passengers began boarding. A middle-aged couple murmured their thanks as they took their seats, while a sharply dressed businessman tapped away on his phone, barely acknowledging Renee's greeting. She was used to it. Then came Byron Lancaster. Tall, commanding, and exuding an air of self-importance, he stepped into the cabin with the kind of ease that suggested he had never once doubted his place in the world. His tailored gray suit was pristine, not a wrinkle in sight, and his gold cufflinks gleamed under the cabin lights. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a sharpness that suggested he never missed a detail. Trailing behind him was his assistant, a woman in her early 30s who looked perpetually overworked, her hands full with a tablet and a leather briefcase. Byron barely acknowledged the flight attendants as he moved toward his seat, 1A front and center, like a throne in his airborne kingdom. Renee approached him with the same professionalism she always maintained. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lancaster. Welcome aboard. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Byron barely glanced at her before responding. His tone clipped. "Macallan." "Neat." Renee nodded, making a mental note. His dismissiveness didn't faze her. She had seen his type before. Men who believed power was measured in how little attention they gave to those serving them. As she turned to retrieve the drink, she caught a whisper from behind. "Unbelievable." She glanced toward the source. A man seated in 2A, a well-dressed older gentleman with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking watch. He smirked at her, shaking his head. "Excuse me?" Renee asked, keeping her tone neutral. The man leaned back, gesturing lazily toward Byron. "I just find it amusing. A company like Aerolux, all about exclusivity, and yet—" He let the sentence hang, his gaze flickering to Renee. She understood immediately, and suddenly she realized this was not just another day at work. This was a test. Byron hadn't simply chosen Nova Skyways for convenience. This flight was about something bigger: power, competition, and, more than likely, the future of the airline industry. And Renee was about to be caught in the middle of it. As she returned with Byron's drink, setting it down gently on the polished tray beside his seat, she noticed a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Not at her, but at what she represented. She was not what he expected to see in the first-class cabin of an airline vying to challenge his empire. Byron took the glass, swirling the amber liquid for a moment before speaking, his voice low but deliberate. "You've been with Nova Skyways long?" Renee kept her expression composed. "Yes, sir." Byron took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes still studying her. "Interesting." That was all he said. But Renee knew a battle had just begun. The plane taxied smoothly toward the runway, the hum of its engines a steady vibration beneath Renee's feet. Through the large cabin windows, the sprawling cityscape of New York gleamed under the morning sun, a sight she had seen countless times but never had the luxury of admiring. She wasn't thinking about the view. Her mind remained on Byron Lancaster in the strange, deliberate way he had looked at her, not as a flight attendant, not as just another uniformed employee on the plane. No, he had assessed her, like a man measuring the strength of a rope before he decided whether to pull it or cut it. Why? She had dealt with difficult passengers before, arrogant men who thought the sky belonged to them. But this was different. Byron wasn't rude the way many wealthy travelers could be. He was calculating, as if she were a piece in some unspoken game she hadn't even realized she was playing. The seatbelt sign dinged. The aircraft lifted off, climbing effortlessly into the sky, leaving New York behind. Renee moved through the first-class cabin, ensuring everything was in place. She adjusted a tray here, refilled a water glass there. Her years in the industry had trained her to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to move through luxury with an effortless grace that made her both visible and invisible at the same time. But Byron Lancaster saw her. He watched as she assisted other passengers, his gaze steady, unreadable. Even when she wasn't near him, she could feel the weight of it, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. "You know," a voice murmured behind her, "he's testing you." Renee turned. It was the man in 2A, the one who had made the comment before takeoff. Now that she looked at him properly, there was something familiar about him, the kind of wealth that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. He wasn't just another businessman passing through. She kept her tone professional. "Can I get you something, sir?" The man smirked, shaking his head slightly. "Just an observation. People like Lancaster, they don't look at just anyone like that. He's deciding something about you." Renee resisted the urge to ask what, but something in her face must have given her away, because the man chuckled. "You don't know who I am, do you?" "I'm afraid I don't," Renee admitted. The man extended a hand. "Victor Harrington." The name clicked immediately. Harrington Aerospace, a powerhouse in the aviation industry, one of the largest investors in luxury air travel. Her stomach tightened. What the hell was happening on this flight? Two of the most powerful men in the industry, both aboard Nova Skyways, both seemingly paying close attention to her. And then, another voice joined the conversation. "You have something to say, Harrington?" Byron. He hadn't moved from his seat, but his presence stretched into the space between them like an invisible rope tightening around the air. Harrington smiled, the kind of easy grin men like him used when they knew they were getting under someone's skin. "Not at all, just appreciating the service." Byron didn't break eye contact with him, but Renee felt the subtle shift in power between them. There was animosity here, old and well-worn, and she was standing in the middle of it. Renee excused herself, stepping away before she was dragged further into whatever silent war was unfolding between these two men. But as she turned, she heard Byron's voice, quiet but sharp. "She doesn't belong here, Victor." The words hit harder than she expected. She, not this airline, not this crew. She. Renee kept walking, her hands steady, her expression neutral. But inside, something was shifting. For years, she had told herself she was fine staying in the background, that being good at her job was enough. But this was something else. For the first time, she wanted to know why Byron Lancaster cared so much about who she was. The soft murmur of conversation filled the first-class cabin, punctuated by the occasional clink of fine glassware. The steady hum of the engines was a constant backdrop, a sound Renee Caldwell had long since learned to tune out. But her mind wasn't on the flight, nor on the routine of service. It was on Byron Lancaster's words. "She doesn't belong here, Victor." The statement had settled into her chest like a stone. There was no mistaking his meaning. It wasn't about her job performance, her professionalism, or her experience. It was about her presence in this space, a space that men like Byron had controlled for far too long. Renee had worked flights carrying celebrities, politicians, and business tycoons. Some were dismissive, some entitled. A rare few were kind. But never before had she felt as if her very existence in the cabin was being weighed like a factor in a high-stakes negotiation. And yet, here she was. She moved through the aisle, refilling drinks, adjusting blankets, responding to small requests with her usual efficiency. But she could feel Byron's eyes tracking her movements. He wasn't just dismissing her. He was studying her. She wasn't sure which was worse. Halfway through the flight, she returned to Byron's seat in 1A, ensuring his glass was full before moving on. But this time, he spoke before she could step away. "Miss Caldwell." Her fingers stilled on the tray. She lifted her gaze, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, Mr. Lancaster?" He leaned back slightly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "How long have you been with Nova Skyways?" His voice was even, but there was something beneath it, a probing curiosity, as if he were digging for something specific. "Several years," she replied. Byron nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And do you enjoy it?" The question was strange. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. "Yes," Renee answered carefully. "I take pride in my work." "Do you?" Byron mused, his voice almost lazy. "Or do you want more?" A flicker of something passed through her, but she didn't let it show. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said evenly. Byron held her gaze for a moment longer, then chuckled softly. He took a slow sip of his drink before turning his attention to Victor Harrington, seated in 2A. "You know, Victor, it's fascinating," Byron said, his tone shifting into something calculated, controlled. "Celeste Durham's airline has been making a lot of noise lately, talking about change, about breaking barriers, and yet," he gestured vaguely, his fingers tapping the rim of his glass, "some barriers are there for a reason." Renee felt the air in the cabin shift. A few other passengers, executives, power players, people who understood the coded language of corporate warfare, were subtly listening in. She wasn't stupid. This wasn't just about her. This was about Nova Skyways, about Celeste Durham, about what this airline represented to men like Byron. Victor Harrington exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You're predictable, Byron. You always have been." Byron smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "And you're naive if you think Durham's vision for this industry will last." Victor shrugged. "People said the same thing about your father when he started Aerolux. Times change, Byron." Byron's jaw tightened just slightly, but it was enough. Victor had hit a nerve. Renee wasn't sure what history lay between them, but she could feel the tension deepening like a crack in glass, and she was still standing right in the middle of it. "Excuse me," she said smoothly, stepping away before either man could pull her further into whatever game of power they were playing. She walked back toward the galley, but before she disappeared from view, she heard Byron's voice again, this time quieter, but carrying just as much weight. "Nova Skyways won't last, and neither will she." Renee's breath caught. She knew he meant Celeste Durham, but she also knew he meant her too. And for the first time in her career, she realized she wasn't just serving drinks on this flight. She was a symbol of everything Byron Lancaster wanted to destroy. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. It wasn't visible in any obvious way. No raised voices, no sudden outbursts. But Renee could feel it, like the weight of an approaching storm. Byron Lancaster had spoken his words casually, as if they were nothing more than a passing remark. But Renee knew better. Men like him never said anything without purpose. "Nova Skyways won't last, and neither will she." The words followed her into the galley, unshakable, intrusive. She gripped the counter for a moment, steadying herself, focusing on the cool metal beneath her fingertips. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, dismissed, or silently pushed aside. But this was different. This wasn't about whether a manager saw her as a leadership material. It wasn't about whether a passenger thought she was capable of handling first-class service. Byron Lancaster had made it clear. This was bigger. She exhaled, rolled back her shoulders, and straightened her posture before stepping back into the cabin. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of rattling her. Not today, not ever. As she moved through the aisle, she caught Victor Harrington watching her again. But this time his expression wasn't laced with amusement. It was measured, thoughtful. She wasn't sure what he saw when he looked at her, but she knew he had heard Byron's words too. He hadn't responded, and that meant something. She continued her routine, checking on passengers, ensuring service remained seamless. But when she reached Byron's seat again, she found his assistant looking uncomfortable, shifting her weight as she balanced a tablet and notebook in her lap. "Is everything all right?" Renee asked, keeping her voice neutral. The woman, a brunette in her 30s, professionally put together but visibly tense, hesitated before responding. "Yes," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Byron, still reclined in his seat, didn't even glance at his assistant. "She's fine." The assistant's fingers clenched slightly around the edge of her tablet, but she said nothing. Renee didn't push, but she didn't look away either. She knew what it was like to feel powerless in a space where others held all the control. After a beat, she nodded. "Let me know if you need anything." She walked away, but not before she noticed the way Byron's lips curled into the faintest smirk. He had seen the exchange. He had seen her notice, and he liked it. Later, as the flight continued, Victor Harrington motioned her over as she passed his seat. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. Renee hesitated. It wasn't common for crew members to sit with passengers, especially not in first class. But something about his tone told her he wasn't making a request. She sat down, keeping her posture straight, her hands folded in her lap. "You've caught his attention," Victor said plainly. Renee didn't pretend not to understand. "I'm just doing my job." Victor let out a quiet laugh. "Maybe, but that's not what he sees." She exhaled, glancing at Byron across the cabin. He wasn't looking at them now, but she knew he knew they were talking. "Tell me something, Miss Caldwell," Victor continued, his voice lowering just slightly. "Do you know what this flight is really about?" Renee looked at him, searching for some hint of where this was going. "It's a routine route from JFK to SFO." Victor shook his head. "Number? It's a meeting ground." Her stomach tensed. Victor leaned back slightly. "Celeste Durham is expanding Nova Skyways. She's challenging Aerolux. This flight, this little 6-hour trip across the country, is a statement. It says Nova Skyways belongs in the same space as men like Lancaster." His gaze sharpened. "And you're part of that statement." Renee swallowed, her mind processing his words. "Why me?" she asked. Victor's lips curled slightly. "Because Byron Lancaster doesn't believe women like you belong in spaces like this. And if Nova Skyways is proving him wrong, that makes you a problem." The words hit deeper than she expected. She had spent years believing she was invisible to men like Byron, that her presence was tolerated but never truly acknowledged. But now she realized she wasn't invisible at all. She was a challenge, and Byron Lancaster didn't lose challenges. Victor's voice cut through her thoughts. "So, Miss Caldwell, what are you going to do about it?" Renee lifted her chin. "I'm going to keep doing my job." Victor smirked, but there was something approving in his expression. "Good." He lifted his glass slightly in an unspoken toast, and as Renee walked away, she felt something new settling inside her. Not fear, resolve. The first-class cabin had settled into a lull. Some passengers dozed beneath cashmere blankets, their reclined seats cocooning them in luxury. Others remained occupied with their screens, tapping away at laptops or scrolling through financial reports. The gentle hum of the engines created a low, steady rhythm, a deceptive calm, masking the undercurrent of tension that had begun to coil beneath the surface. Renee Caldwell wasn't relaxed. Victor Harrington's words still lingered in her mind. "So, Miss Caldwell, what are you going to do about it?" She had answered instinctively, but the reality was more complicated. It wasn't just about her job. This was about something bigger, something that had been unfolding long before she stepped onto this plane. Men like Byron Lancaster saw people like her as disruptions. Celeste Durham had built Nova Skyways to challenge their monopoly, and Renee, whether she had asked for it or not, was now part of that fight. She wasn't just serving drinks. She was proving Byron Lancaster wrong with every step she took down this aisle. And that, she realized, was dangerous. She was preparing a fresh round of service when a quiet voice stopped her. "Miss Caldwell." She turned. It was Byron's assistant. The woman stood hesitantly near the galley, her shoulders tense, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest. Up close, the strain in her face was unmistakable. Not just exhaustion, but something deeper, something wary. "Can I help you?" Renee asked. The woman shifted, glancing briefly toward Byron's seat before returning her gaze to Renee. "I just wanted to say," she began, then hesitated. Renee waited. Finally, the woman exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not wrong about him." A slow tension spread through Renee's spine. Byron's assistant, the woman who worked closest to him, who had seen the inner workings of his empire firsthand, was standing in front of her, confirming what Renee already knew but hadn't dared say aloud. Before Renee could respond, the woman continued, her voice tightening. "I shouldn't even be talking to you." That set off alarms. Renee's eyes flickered toward Byron. He was still seated, deep in conversation with Victor Harrington. His posture was relaxed, his expression unreadable, but Renee knew he was always aware of his surroundings. The assistant straightened, composing herself. "Forget I said anything." She turned to leave, but Renee reached out, not touching her, but stopping her with words. "You don't have to stay with him," she said quietly. The woman flinched just barely, before shaking her head. "You don't understand." Then she was gone. Renee stood there, gripping the counter of the galley as her pulse quickened. She didn't have all the pieces yet, but one thing was clear. Byron Lancaster wasn't just a corporate predator. He was something worse. And if his own assistant was afraid to speak, then Renee knew she was treading dangerous ground. She returned to the cabin, her steps measured, her expression unreadable. The moment she stepped back into the aisle, Byron Lancaster lifted his gaze and locked eyes with her. A slow, deliberate smile stretched across his face. He knew. Somehow, he always knew. And for the first time, Renee understood exactly what kind of battle she was walking into. This wasn't about corporate competition. This was about power, about control. And Byron Lancaster didn't like losing control. The seatbelt sign dinged softly overhead as the aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet. The steady hum of the engines remained constant, a sound Renee Caldwell had grown accustomed to over the years. Normally, flights like this passed in a blur, routine, efficient, uneventful. But this flight was anything but normal. She could still feel Byron Lancaster's gaze on her, even when she wasn't looking in his direction. His presence wasn't just physical, it was an assertion of power, a constant, calculated reminder that he was watching, and worse, waiting. For what, she wasn't sure yet. As she moved down the aisle, ensuring everything remained in order, she noticed Victor Harrington watching her again. But this time he wasn't smirking. He was studying. When she reached his seat, he gestured to the empty one across from him. "Sit." Renee hesitated, but after a moment, she did. Victor exhaled slowly, glancing briefly toward Byron before returning his attention to her. "You know what he's doing, don't you?" Renee kept her voice measured. "Enlighten me." Victor smiled slightly, but there was no amusement behind it. "He's testing you," he said simply. "Not just you, but what you represent. Nova Skyways is making waves, and Celeste Durham is threatening everything he's built. You? You're proof that the industry is changing." Renee didn't respond immediately. She didn't need Victor to tell her that men like Byron hated change. But then Victor's voice dropped slightly, the casual air disappearing. "Careful, Miss Caldwell. If he sees you as a threat, he won't just ignore you. He'll break you." A slow chill spread through her spine. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew Victor was right. Byron Lancaster wasn't just a competitor. He was a strategist. And Renee, she was a problem he was deciding how to eliminate. She returned to her duties, but the weight of Victor's warning pressed against her thoughts. A few minutes later, she felt movement near Byron's seat. He stood, stretching briefly before adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit. Then, with a slow, deliberate pace, he made his way toward the galley, toward her. Renee steeled herself. She was ready, or at least she thought she was. Byron stopped just a foot away, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice low enough that only she could hear, he said, "Enjoying your flight, Miss Caldwell?" She didn't flinch. She refused to let him see anything but calm professionalism. "Yes, Mr. Lancaster. Is there something I can assist you with?" Byron tilted his head slightly, as if considering her. Then after a beat, he smiled. That same slow, knowing smile that felt more like a warning than anything else. "Not at the moment," he said smoothly, "but give it time." Then just like that, he turned and walked back to his seat. Renee stood there, her pulse steady, her expression neutral. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just a game of words anymore. Byron Lancaster had just declared war. The rhythmic hum of the engines filled the cabin, masking the subtle tension that had settled in the air like an approaching storm. Renee Caldwell had been on countless flights, but none had ever carried the same unspoken weight as this one. Byron Lancaster's words still lingered. "Not at the moment, but give it time." It wasn't a threat, not directly, but men like him never spoke without purpose. It was a promise, a move made long before she had even realized she was a piece on the board. And now she needed to figure out exactly what game he was playing. As she moved through the first-class cabin, ensuring every passenger remained comfortable, she caught Victor Harrington's gaze once again. But this time, he wasn't calling her over. This time, he was watching Byron. Renee followed his line of sight, turning just in time to see Byron rise from his seat once more, adjusting his cufflinks in that same deliberate way. But instead of heading toward the galley, he walked straight toward her. The passengers near them barely noticed. That was the power men like Byron held. They could disrupt an entire room while making it seem like they hadn't moved at all. Byron stopped just beside her, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Join me for a drink, Miss Caldwell." It wasn't a question. Renee met his gaze, keeping her expression unreadable. "I'm on duty, Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice even. His lips curved into that infuriatingly knowing smile. "I think we can make an exception." Before she could respond, he turned and walked toward the private conference suite at the front of the first-class cabin, a space typically reserved for meetings between executives or high-profile passengers who required discretion. Renee stood still for a beat, considering her options. She could refuse, but she already knew Byron Lancaster wasn't the type of man who accepted no easily. And if she walked away now, she would be playing right into his hands, proving to him that she was afraid. So with a deep breath, she followed. Inside the suite, Byron had already settled into one of the leather chairs, his posture relaxed but entirely in control. A second glass of whiskey sat untouched on the table across from him. He gestured toward it. "Sit." Renee remained standing. "What do you want, Mr. Lancaster?" He tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "You're direct. I like that." She didn't respond. Byron exhaled, swirling the liquid in his glass before finally speaking. "Nova Skyways is a disruption," he said. "Celeste Durham built it on an idea that airlines should cater to more than just people like me. And now she's gaining ground." Renee said nothing, but her fingers curled subtly against her side. "That's not a problem," Byron continued. "Competitors rise and fall all the time. What is a problem?" He leaned forward slightly. "Is you?" A slow chill spread down Renee's spine. She had suspected it, but hearing him say it out loud was something else entirely. Byron smiled again, as if reading her thoughts. "You're not invisible, Miss Caldwell. Not anymore. The moment you stepped into this cabin, you became a symbol of everything Celeste Durham wants to change." He took a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down with a soft clink. "That makes you valuable." Renee's breath steadied. "Valuable to who?" Byron's smile sharpened. "To me." The silence in the room thickened. She should have been shocked, but instead a strange sense of clarity settled over her. This wasn't just a conversation. It was an offer. And Byron Lancaster never made an offer unless he was sure of the outcome. Renee lifted her chin. And what exactly are you offering, Mr. Lancaster? Byron leaned back, his gaze never wavering. A seat at the real table. Her pulse remained steady, but her mind raced. She could play dumb, pretend she didn't understand. But she did. Byron Lancaster was offering her a way out, a chance to step off the battlefield before the war even began. But at what cost? She exhaled slowly, then met his gaze head-on. I already have a seat, Mr. Lancaster. Byron studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had met him, he laughed. Low, quiet, but genuine. Bold, he murmured. But boldness doesn't always win wars, Miss Caldwell. He reached for his glass again, lifting it slightly. Let's see if Celeste Durham has prepared you for what's coming. And just like that, the game had officially begun. The door to the private conference suite closed behind Renee with a quiet click. But the weight of the conversation with Byron Lancaster lingered like a heavy mist clinging to her skin. He had made his position clear. She was valuable, not because of her skills, not because of her experience, but because of what she represented. A challenge, a disruption, a symbol of everything Celeste Durham was fighting for. And Byron had given her an out, a chance to walk away from whatever storm was coming. Renee wasn't naive. Men like Byron Lancaster never gave without expectation. His offer wasn't generosity, it was a calculated move, a way to remove her from the board before she became a bigger problem. She had refused, and that, she knew, was just as much a move as his was. She returned to the galley, rolling her shoulders back as if she could shake off the tension that had settled there. But her pulse still thrummed beneath her skin, a steady reminder that she had just done something very dangerous. Byron wasn't a man who took rejection lightly, and now she had his full attention. Linda, the veteran flight attendant, passed by, shooting her a curious glance. You okay? Renee forced a small smile. Yeah, just a long flight. Linda gave her a knowing look but didn't push. She had worked in the industry long enough to recognize when someone wasn't saying everything. As Linda continued down the aisle, Renee exhaled slowly, pressing a hand against the cool metal counter. She needed to stay focused. She had a job to do. But as she turned, her gaze flickered toward Victor Harrington, still seated in 2A. And he was watching her. Again. His expression wasn't smug or amused this time. It was calculated, considering. He knew. Somehow he knew. Renee straightened and made her way toward him, keeping her pace measured. She didn't sit this time, didn't wait for an invitation. You knew what he was going to do, she said quietly. Victor's mouth curved slightly. I suspected. Renee exhaled, gripping the edge of the seat in front of her. And what would you have done? Victor's gaze sharpened. What I always do, watch and wait. She let out a dry laugh. That's not an answer. Victor shrugged. It's the only one that matters. Renee glanced briefly at Byron, now reclined in his seat, looking perfectly at ease. He wasn't watching her anymore, but she knew he was still playing the game, and she was still a piece in it. You made a choice today, Miss Caldwell, Victor said, his voice quieter. I hope you know what it means. Renee didn't answer, because she wasn't sure yet, but she had a feeling she was about to find out, and soon. The cabin remained quiet, a fragile calm stretching between the passengers. The golden glow of the overhead lights bathed everything in a soft warmth, but Renee Caldwell felt anything but at ease. Byron Lancaster sat comfortably in 1A, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his expression unreadable. She had seen men like him before, powerful, ruthless, always 3 steps ahead. But this wasn't just about him. It was about what came next. Renee had refused his offer, and now she was waiting for his next move. She continued her rounds, keeping her pace even, her posture composed. She had no intention of giving Byron the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. But as she passed by a group of executives in first class, she caught fragments of a conversation. Low voices, urgent whispers. Rumors about Nova Skyways. A legal issue, something about compliance. Durham's facing pressure. Renee's stomach tightened. She turned just slightly, enough to see Victor Harrington listening to the conversation as well. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tapped slowly against the armrest. He knew something. She wanted to ask him what, but she didn't get the chance. Because suddenly, Byron Lancaster was looking directly at her, and smirking. Renee clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain neutral as she stepped away. But inside, her thoughts were racing. Something was happening, and Byron knew exactly what it was. Minutes later, as she refilled drinks in the galley, her phone buzzed inside her uniform pocket. That wasn't normal. Nova Skyways had strict policies about personal phones being on during flights, except for emergencies. She pulled it out discreetly and felt her stomach drop. A single message from Celeste Durham. "Call me as soon as you land." That was all it said. No details, no explanations, just a direct, urgent command. Renee didn't need details to know what it meant. Byron Lancaster had made his move. And now it was her turn to decide what came next. Renee Caldwell slipped her phone back into her pocket, but the message from Celeste Durham might as well have been burned into her mind. "Call me as soon as you land." She didn't need details. She already knew. Byron Lancaster had made his first move, and whatever it was big. She turned, pressing her palms against the cold metal of the galley counter, grounding herself. She needed to think. Byron had warned her, not at the moment, but give it time. This wasn't about her, not entirely. This was about Nova Skyways, about Celeste Durham, about the future of this industry. And now she was caught in the middle of it. The rest of the flight stretched endlessly. Passengers remained unaware, lost in their meals and in-flight entertainment. First class carried on as usual. Glasses refilled, napkins folded, every need met with seamless precision. But beneath the surface, Renee felt the undercurrent of something shifting. Byron sat comfortably in 1A, exuding the kind of effortless confidence that came with knowing you had already won a battle before your opponent even realized there was a fight. Victor Harrington, he was watching everything. Renee had never cared about corporate politics before. She was good at her job, and that had always been enough. But now her very presence had become a battlefield. She didn't know what Byron had set in motion, but she knew one thing. Celeste Durham wouldn't call unless the storm had already arrived. When the plane finally began its descent into San Francisco, Renee's pulse ticked higher. Byron stretched his arms, adjusting his cufflinks, completely at ease, as if this was just another flight. But when Renee passed his seat, he looked up and met her gaze, and smiled. Not in amusement, not in kindness, but in victory. She didn't let her expression falter. She refused to let him see doubt. But deep inside, she knew. Byron Lancaster had already played his next move, and now it was her turn. The wheels of flight NX-217 touched down on the runway at San Francisco International Airport, the gentle thud reverberating through the cabin. A smooth landing, the kind Renee Caldwell had experienced hundreds of times. But this time, she felt no relief. Celeste Durham was waiting, and Byron Lancaster was still watching. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the usual movement began. Passengers stretching, reaching for their bags, the quiet shuffle of people eager to disembark. Renee moved through the first-class cabin, keeping her expression neutral, assisting passengers as she always did. But inside, she was bracing herself, because whatever waited beyond this plane, it wasn't good news. Byron Lancaster took his time. He remained seated while other passengers gathered their belongings. He wasn't in a rush. Men like him never were. When he finally stood, he adjusted his suit jacket, exuding the same effortless confidence he always carried. Then, as Renee stepped aside to let him pass, he paused, just for a moment, and then he leaned in. His voice was low, deliberate, for her ears only. "See you soon, Miss Caldwell." Renee didn't react, didn't flinch. She kept her expression unreadable, because she knew that's what he wanted, a reaction, a tell. She gave him nothing. Byron smiled. Then he walked off the plane, disappearing down the jet bridge, taking his victory with him. The moment the last passenger had deboarded, Renee grabbed her phone and stepped into the galley. She barely had to think before pressing Celeste Durham's number. The call barely rang twice before Celeste picked up. "Renee, where are you?" Renee didn't waste time. "We just landed." Celeste's voice was tight, uncharacteristically sharp. Get to the office. Now. That was all she said before hanging up. Renee exhaled, staring at the dark screen of her phone. She didn't know what Byron had done, but she knew one thing for certain. The war had officially begun. The ride from San Francisco International Airport to Nova Skyway's corporate headquarters was short, but to Renee Caldwell, it felt like a lifetime. Her phone remained gripped tightly in her hand, though Celeste Durham's voice still echoed in her mind. Get to the office, now. There was no explanation, no reassurance, just urgency. And Renee knew what that meant. Byron Lancaster had made his move. She stared out the window of the rideshare car, the San Francisco skyline passing in a blur. The sun had begun to dip lower, casting the city in a soft golden hue. A beautiful evening, but something had gone terribly wrong. When Renee stepped into the Nova Skyway's headquarters, the tension hit her instantly. The sleek, glass-walled office, normally a place of controlled efficiency, buzzed with quiet chaos. Phone calls, rapid conversations, executives moving through hallways with a sharpness that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a bad day at the office. This was war. She barely had time to take it in before Celeste's assistant appeared. She's waiting for you. Renee followed, her pulse steady despite the storm brewing inside her. And when she stepped into Celeste Durham's office, she finally saw it. The battlefield. Celeste stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, arms crossed, her sharp eyes locked onto the San Francisco skyline. But it wasn't just Celeste in the room. 3 senior executives sat at the conference table, their faces tight with tension. And on the screen mounted to the far wall, a news broadcast was playing. Renee barely had to read the headline to understand. Nova Skyway's under investigation for safety violations. Her stomach clenched. She turned to Celeste, whose expression was unreadable. This is him, isn't it? Renee asked. Celeste finally looked at her. Of course it's him. Byron Lancaster. He had set the pieces in motion before the flight had even landed. Renee exhaled slowly, processing the weight of it. She knew he was powerful. She knew he was dangerous. But this was ruthless. The broadcast continued, the anchor reporting on anonymous whistleblower complaints that had allegedly surfaced against Nova Skyways. Claims of safety violations, tampered inspection reports, a potential federal inquiry. All of it designed to do one thing, undermine the airline's credibility. Celeste crossed her arms. He's not coming for us through competition, Renee. He's coming for us through destruction. Renee clenched her jaw. How bad is it? She asked. One of the executives, Diane Walsh, turned from the table. If the FAA decides to launch a full-scale investigation, it could stall operations. Investors will panic. Our stock is already dipping. If this keeps up, she didn't have to finish the sentence. If this kept up, Nova Skyways wouldn't survive. Celeste finally moved, stepping toward the table, her expression as sharp as steel. We have to hit back. Diane hesitated. Celeste cut her off. We don't play defense, she said firmly. Not against someone like Lancaster. If we let him dictate the terms of this fight, we've already lost. Renee didn't move, didn't speak, but something inside her shifted. She had spent the last few years trying to move up, trying to prove she belonged. But now she realized this was bigger than her career. This was a war for survival. Celeste turned to her. You were on that flight with him, Renee. Did he say anything? Renee exhaled, her mind replaying every interaction, every glance, every carefully chosen word. Then she met Celeste's gaze. He's just getting started. Celeste nodded. Then so are we. And just like that, the counterattack began. The meeting room inside Nova Skyway's headquarters buzzed with tension. Executives huddled over laptops, rapid-fire discussions bouncing off the glass walls. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen continued its slow march across the broadcast. Nova Skyways under federal scrutiny for alleged safety violations. It was a lie. A perfectly orchestrated, meticulously timed lie. And Byron Lancaster was behind it. Renee Caldwell sat at the conference table, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a corporate scandal. It was a strategic attack. A play designed to cripple Nova Skyways, to choke it financially, to make Celeste Durham fold. But Celeste, She wasn't the folding type. Celeste leaned forward, fingers laced together, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "We need to move, fast." The executives murmured, some nodding, others hesitating. Diane Walsh, the head of legal, pushed her glasses up. "Celeste, if we go public with a counter-narrative before we have solid evidence, we'll look defensive." That's exactly what he wants. Celeste's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Renee spoke up. "We don't just need evidence," she said. "We need a target." The room turned toward her. "Byron doesn't do anything without layers of insulation," Renee continued. "He won't leave his fingerprints on this. But someone did. Someone leaked the complaints to the press. Someone fed false reports to the FAA. If we find that person," Celeste nodded slowly, "then we can pull the thread." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the plan settling in. Then Celeste turned to Diane. "Find out who filed the reports. Every name, every contact, every single person who touched this story before it hit the press." Diane hesitated. "That could take days." Celeste's voice was unwavering. "Then you better get started." The meeting ended, and as people dispersed, Celeste pulled Renee aside. "You were on that flight with him," Celeste said. "Tell me everything." Renee exhaled, her mind working fast. "He approached me, tried to feel me out." Celeste's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly," Renee said, "but he wanted me to know I was in the middle of this. He offered me a way out, a seat at the table." Celeste scoffed. "Classic Lancaster." Renee hesitated. "And his assistant?" Celeste frowned. "What about her?" Renee's voice lowered. "She was scared. She wanted to say something but backed off. I don't think she's just an employee. I think she's a liability." Celeste considered that. "If Byron has a weak link, we need to find it," she said. Renee met her gaze. "Then let me do it." Celeste's expression remained unreadable. "You sure?" Renee nodded. "I've spent years playing by the rules, Celeste. But this isn't a game anymore. If I'm in this, I'm in it all the way." Celeste studied her for a beat longer. Then she gave a small nod. "Find her." And just like that, Renee had her next mission. Find Byron's weak link and pull the whole damn thing apart. Renee Caldwell had spent years perfecting the art of blending in, moving through first-class cabins, through luxury, through conversations where she was expected to be present, but not seen. But now she needed to do the opposite. She needed to be seen by the right person. Byron Lancaster's assistant. The woman who had looked at Renee with fear in her eyes. The woman who, despite working beside one of the most powerful men in the industry, had hesitated, as if she knew something she wasn't supposed to know. And if there was one thing Renee understood, it was that fear meant knowledge. And knowledge? That was power. She found her at a bar inside the Ritz-Carlton, a quiet lounge frequented by executives, investors, and people who needed to have conversations off the record. The woman was alone, a glass of white wine in front of her, untouched. Her name, Emily Sloan. Renee had done her research. Emily had been Byron's assistant for 3 years. Before that, she worked in compliance for a major airline. Not a typical career jump. And if Renee had learned anything about Byron Lancaster, it was that he didn't surround himself with people who could outthink him. Emily had value. And right now, she looked like a woman who regretted ever stepping into Byron's world. Renee approached casually, taking the seat next to her without asking. Emily stiffened, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass. "I don't want any trouble," she said quietly. Renee smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Neither do I." Emily exhaled, staring ahead at the bottles lined behind the bar. "You shouldn't be here." "You shouldn't be drinking alone," Renee countered. Emily let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "You don't get it." "Then explain it to me," Renee said. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're scared. And people like Byron Lancaster, they don't keep scared people close unless they have something to lose." Emily went still. Then finally she turned toward Renee, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I talk, I lose everything." Renee met her gaze. "What if you don't?" Emily studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something deep in her mind. Then, for the first time since they met, she exhaled like a woman about to make a choice she couldn't take back. And Renee knew. She had found the crack in Byron's armor. Now all she had to do was break it wide open. Emily Sloane stared down at her untouched wine, her fingers trembling slightly against the stem of the glass. For a moment, Renee Caldwell thought she might back out, might choose self-preservation over truth. And Renee wouldn't blame her. Byron Lancaster wasn't just a corporate powerhouse. He was dangerous, not in a physical way, but in the way powerful men operated when they decided someone had become a liability. If Emily talked, she wasn't just betraying her employer. She was putting herself in the line of fire. But then, Emily exhaled, slow and controlled, as if accepting something inevitable. And Renee knew. She had made her choice. Emily didn't speak immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out a small flash drive and setting it between them on the bar. Renee stared at it, her pulse ticking higher. "What is this?" she asked. Emily didn't look at her. "It's everything," she said simply. Renee's breath caught. Emily finally turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "Byron doesn't just manipulate markets, Renee. He builds entire systems designed to crush competition before it even has a chance to rise. And this is the proof." Renee hesitated, but then, carefully, deliberately, she reached for the drive, slipping it into her pocket. "What happens now?" Emily asked, her voice tight. Renee met her gaze. "Now," she said, standing, "we burn him to the ground." When Renee walked into Celeste Durham's office an hour later, she placed the flash drive on the desk without a word. Celeste raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Renee's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "The end of Byron Lancaster." Celeste picked up the drive, weighing it in her palm, her expression unreadable. Then after a long moment, she met Renee's gaze. "Good work, Caldwell." Renee exhaled, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because Byron Lancaster didn't lose quietly. And when he realized the walls were closing in, he would fight like hell. But Renee, she was ready. Power is not just about wealth or influence. It's about control. Byron Lancaster believed he could dictate who belonged in his world and who didn't. He thought he could silence challenges before they became threats. But in the end, he underestimated the power of those he overlooked. Renee Caldwell was never meant to be a contender in his game. She was just another flight attendant, another unseen force moving through his world. But when she refused to back down, when she chose to fight instead of fold, she proved that power isn't reserved for those who take it. It belongs to those who refuse to be erased. Celeste Durham built Nova Skyways to challenge the status quo. But true change doesn't come from the top. It comes from the people willing to stand their ground. So the question is, what would you do when faced with a system designed to push you out? Would you accept it? Or would you fight for your place? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories of power, resilience, and the fight for justice, don't forget to subscribe. Because this is just the beginning.